Help defend the Church by becoming a supporter of OnePeterFive. Your tax-deductible contributions make it possible for us to continue our work of informing and inspiring the faithful, of rebuilding Catholic culture and restoring Catholic tradition. Make a real difference. Go to onepeterfive.com/donate today.
You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
It is a real joy for us to welcome you all here. Habemus Papam.
Rebuilding Catholic culture, restoring Catholic tradition.
Hello and welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, episode 41, I think. It's been a while since I've done a podcast. My apologies to those of you who have been asking me to get back to it. We're doing it today, and my guest is Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, a founding faculty member at Wyoming Catholic College, where he also directs the choir and schola. He's also the author of several books, including Resurgent in the Midst of Crisis, and over 500 articles in print and online. He also has the distinction of being an original contributor to OnePeterFive, having been one of the first 5 authors we published on opening day. And I can't believe this is the first time I've done a podcast with you. Peter, welcome.
Thank you so much, Steve.
So let me ask you this. How did you wind up specializing in liturgy? Because that's kind of your thing, liturgy, sacred music.
That's true. It was not something I ever expected to do. It isn't as if I had an overwhelming interest in it from a young age. But it was discovering the traditional Mass in college, at Thomas Aquinas College, where I was attending it on a fairly regular basis, discovering it there and starting to learn about the history of the Church, the history of the liturgy. My eyes began to open to, first of all, how beautiful the traditional liturgy of the Church is. It really seized my heart. It lifted my spirit, and the chant as well, which I had also discovered around that same time. But then also just seeing the devastation and learning more about the shenanigans of the revolutionaries who took all of these beautiful things away from us in the name of accessibility and relevance and so on, aggiornamento. So I think it was a combination of just the excitement of falling in love with the liturgy and then also a certain righteous indignation at wanting to learn what exactly had happened. And then I started reading a lot of books, and my interest in philosophy and theology just ended up moving heavily in that direction.
So you encountered the liturgical tradition of the Church for the first time at TAC.
I did. There was one strange experience I had in high school when I had a great teacher who put me on to St. Thomas Aquinas and to Thomas Aquinas College as well, but also told me about the Latin Mass. I'd never heard of it before. This is this is in the 1980s, late 80s.
You were born in the 70s, like
yes.
me, right? So yeah,
1971.
Definitely post-conciliar, yeah.
Exactly. And so he told me that there was this Latin Mass, but he didn't tell me where to find it. And out of natural curiosity, I looked it up I don't even remember how I found out that there was a Latin Mass somewhere in my vicinity, but I went to it. It turned out it was in a hotel conference room. It was probably some kind of independent or schismatic group.
Right.
And it was just a bizarre experience all the way around. I had no idea what was going on. So I don't consider that to be a real first experience. That was just a sort of Twilight Zone experience.
I realize I've known you for years, but where was this? I don't know where you grew up. I mean, you're a cradle Catholic, right? I mean, you're not a convert.
Exactly. No, I grew up, I'm the youngest of 6 children, and I was born in Chicago, as all of my other brothers and sisters were. But when I was 1, my folks moved to New Jersey. So I actually grew up in New Jersey, about an hour from New York City.
So you're a fellow East Coaster then. That's good.
That's right.
I didn't know that.
But the real discovery of the Mass for me was in college. As I said to you, I went to TAC. Mm-hmm. And at the time, that was 1990 to 94. Obviously the motu proprio hadn't come out. As a matter of fact, even John Paul II's Ecclesia Dei had, the ink had hardly dried on that. And the attitude both in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles under Mahoney and the attitude on campus among the administrators was cool, definitely not favorable. So we only had the old Mass once a month. But
Yeah.
we also had a chaplain who loved to celebrate the traditional Mass, and he would do it on a regular basis privately. And so the word would go around the student body. There'd be a whisper here and a whisper there. Oh, tonight there's going to be a Mass at 7:00. And then a bunch of people would show up for it. So
I don't know how many of our listeners remember the days of the indult. I mean, I'm starting to feel really old now.
Right.
But prior to 2007, you were lucky if you could find a single traditional Latin Mass in a diocese somewhere at a weird time.
Yes, it's true. It always reminds me of that amusing bit in C.S. Lewis's, I think it's in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where they arrive on an island and they want to see the governor, but he's only in his office on the second Tuesday of every other month, at 3:00 or something. So it's just like that.
It's like a speakeasy Catholicism.
Right.
You have to have the password at the door when you get in.
It's
so
true.
I mean, I would imagine at TAC it was probably one of the only masses available in California at the time, I would assume.
That's right. Yes, Cardinal Mahoney, in his pastoral benevolence, had decided that the Latin Mass should be available, but each Sunday it was going to be in a different location. And so one Sunday...
Like, where in the world is Carmen
Right.
Sandiego version of going to Mass? Yeah.
It's true. So one Sunday it was at the college officially, and then another Sunday somewhere else, and another Sunday somewhere else. And I have to tell you, though, it added an element of excitement and danger, just being alive at that time and discovering something that was officially frowned upon or even forbidden. It made you feel like the English martyrs, when you read later about the English martyrs and how they would sneak from one noble house to another, and they'd hide in the walls, and they'd carry their vestments, sewn up in a suitcase so you couldn't find them. And, it was all very...
Cloak and dagger, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me ask you this. I talk a lot about the traditional Mass, but you've really spent, the majority of your career as a theologian investigating the history of the liturgical project, the so-called liturgical reform. How did it get started and where did it go wrong?
Yeah, it's a good question. And please feel free to interrupt me because it is such a huge question. I think it all begins with a growing awareness after the Council of Trent. I think it begins as early as that, but especially in the 19th century, a growing awareness of the distance or the gap that had arisen between the faithful and the clergy celebrating the liturgy. It really is just a fact that if you went to a typical Catholic church sometime in the 19th century, the faithful were largely not following any of the prayers of the Mass or singing any of the chants. Really, they were praying the Rosary, which is beautiful. They were praying various devotional manuals, especially ones that would relate parts of the Mass to the life of Christ. And all of these things were nourishing for them. And I never, ever want to speak down about those private devotions. But there wasn't much of a liturgical life for the faithful at that point. And that's where you have someone like Dom Prosper Guéranger coming on the scene and writing his monumental work, The Liturgical Year, which is still in print and still wonderfully nourishing. He comes on the scene and he's telling the people, look, you need to get to know the riches of the Church's liturgy. The existing liturgy, the real traditional liturgy, is what he wanted to introduce people to. And it's at this time, late 19th, early 20th centuries, that you have a wave of daily missals being produced with a vernacular translation of the ordinary of the Mass and the propers of the Mass, the readings and so forth.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you, because when you say that, I mean, obviously, we have this understanding of the distinction between the ordained and the baptismal priesthood, and we don't add to the Mass by being there. The priest and what he does is efficacious on our behalf, and I think that theological understanding is helpful when people object to the idea of private devotions during the liturgy. But at the same time, to the extent that we can be engaged, that's a good thing. So you're saying that 19th century people didn't have things, at least it wasn't common to have things like a hand missal. I mean, is that true?
Exactly. That is true. I mean, in earlier centuries, you can find wealthy families that could afford to commission or print their own devotional books, which would often include parts of the Mass. And there were little sodality and confraternity booklets that had the ordinary of the Mass. But for the most part, the idea of following the antiphons and the prayers and the preface and all these sorts of things that a lot of us take for granted now and really appreciate, that certainly wouldn't have been a common thing. Partly because also literacy was not.
That's what I was going to ask, was it because of literacy? So yeah, I mean, we're still on this hangover of, it's a 16th century invention, the printing press, and we're still catching up.
Exactly. So then let me just pick it up from there. Guéranger is generally considered the father or the grandfather, as it were, of the liturgical movement. And the liturgical movement, it gets a bad rap now because of the corruption of it that came later. But I think if you're looking from, say, 1850 till probably about 1950, with some notable exceptions as you get into the 20th century. In that century, the vast majority of priests and religious who were promoting what was called the liturgical movement simply wanted to introduce the faithful into the riches of the existing liturgy. They wanted, they promoted things like the ward method for singing Gregorian chant. They promoted education in Latin. They promoted the use of the daily missal or the hand missal. And so they were trying to find ways of opening up this immense treasure to the faithful. And that's really what the liturgical movement was all about. Now, you asked before, how did the reform get going and how did it go off the tracks? Really, the liturgical movement, sometime in the, let's say, 1940s and 50s, certain members of it began to think in a more radical way. They began to think, and I don't want to suggest where these ideas came from, but I don't think they were good ideas. They started to think that, maybe the modern faithful really just can't get into these medieval prayers. Maybe the whole liturgy is just so old, so ancient, so cobwebbed, that it just doesn't speak to modern people anymore. Maybe what they need is a radically simplified liturgy, or a liturgy in modern language, kind of like what was going on in architecture and in other arts, right? There was a new modern style. So shouldn't the liturgy also, in a sense, keep up with the progress of time, the progress of culture? Of course, I can make all sorts of arguments against this. I'm just saying these are the ideas that were floating in the air. And I don't know how much would have come of this if it hadn't captured the minds and wills of people in high places, people with power. I'm talking, of course, most of all about Archbishop Montini of Milan, the future Pope Paul VI. He was one of these radicals in the liturgical movement. He agreed with the kind of avant-garde element in that movement. And so once he became Pope Paul VI, he was able to throw his papal authority behind a certain kind of reform that, for all we know, may never have happened had John the 23rd lasted longer. Or
let me take you on a tangent here, because sure. I think what I'm trying to get my mind around here is, how do we get from a liturgical movement that's seeing a disintegration of the faithful attending Mass and actually, being engaged in the liturgy. I think of, that little quote from Pope St. Pius X that's printed in the beginning of the Ecclesia Dei booklets that are in a lot of traditional parishes about, what it means to really pray the Mass, this engagement of the mind and the heart and following the prayers of the priest and all this. That seems to me an authentic expression of what that liturgical movement was trying to get at. And then you wind up 50 years later, and why are they trying to just completely remake the entire thing? How does the one connect to the other?
Exactly. No, it's true. And I love that quotation from Pius X. It bears mentioning here, as an aside, that Pius X was the great hero of the liturgical movement. He himself studied books written by people from Guéranger's generation. And when he was Pope, the first thing he did is came out with that motu proprio tra Sollecitudini about sacred music, how it needs to be restored, how Gregorian chant needs to be restored, and the Italian operatic style needs to be excluded from the church, and so on. So we could talk about that later if you want. But he definitely was a major force, and he's the first Pope who used the term active participation, but he understood it correctly, not in a superficial way.
Let me read the quote really quick for those who aren't familiar with it, because I think that it is the briefest sort of elevator speech synopsis of what the liturgical movement was about. It reads, "The Holy Mass is a prayer itself, even the highest prayer that exists. It is the sacrifice dedicated by our Redeemer at the cross and repeated every day on the altar. If you wish to hear Mass as it should be heard, you must follow with the eye, heart, and mouth all that happens at the altar. Further, you must pray with the priest the holy words said by him in the name of Christ, and which Christ says by him. You have to associate your heart with the holy feelings which are contained in these words, and in this manner you ought to follow all that happens at the altar. When acting in this way, you have prayed Holy Mass." Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen people question the provenance of this, whether it really came from him, but the sentiment, either way, I mean, it seems a good summary of that early liturgical reform movement.
Yes, it's a perfect summary of it. And notice what he says, very interesting to me, that he actually wants the faithful in their hearts to take on themselves the words that the priest is praying, right? Not as if they're vainly imagining themselves to be the priest. They're too intelligent to make that mistake. But because what he's saying on their behalf and with their consent, with their involvement. They are members of the body of Christ, of which he represents the head. So the head and the members together offer the holy sacrifice. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's the whole theology of the Mass in a nutshell, really. So you asked about how did we get from point A to point B?
Yeah, so how do we get from this sentiment of, hey guys, you're at Mass, how about you actually do the deep dive, at least spiritually, intellectually, right. Be in sync with what the priest is doing at the altar so that you have an understanding of its efficacy and everything, to, hey, let's totally remake the Mass that's been around for at least the last 1,500 years in its essential form.
Exactly.
To something totally unrecognizable to Catholics of any generation.
It's interesting, but it seems to have a lot to do with this German scholar, Josef Jungmann. Jungmann wrote some very important scholarly works. His most famous book is called what's it called in English? It's called The Mass of the Roman Rite, is how the English translation reads. It's 2 fat volumes, and he was an immensely learned German scholar of liturgical history. And in this book, he goes through every part of the Mass in incredible detail, talking about the origins of each prayer and each gesture, and all the variations in different places, and so on and so forth. His scholarship is mostly sound and even impeccable. But it seems that he, in his various writings and speeches, he started promoting 2 theories that were going to end up being really devastating. One theory is called the corruption theory. The other one's called the pastoral theory. The corruption theory is this: the Mass was beautiful, elegant, simple, noble for the first several centuries, let's say at the furthest extent, the first millennium, which also happens to be the period when the East and the West were in union with each other. But in the second millennium, the first few centuries of the second millennium, the Middle Ages, in other words, all kinds of accretions were added to the Mass, all kinds of inventions and pious decorations and ornamentations and so on, and that the people in the Middle Ages, they weren't good scholars of liturgy, so they forgot the reason for a lot of the things that were in the liturgy, according to Jungmann. And so basically what you ended up with at the end of the Middle Ages was a highly elaborate and, in their view, somewhat incoherent, theologically incoherent rite of Mass. And many of the things that we love so much about the traditional liturgy actually do come from the Middle Ages. They weren't there at the time of St. Gregory the Great. For example, the offertory, the wonderful offertory prayers are definitely a medieval development, and that's fine because we believe in organic development. But anyway, so according to Jungmann and people who went along with him, these were corruptions of the original, pure, simple essence of the apostolic liturgy. So
he's not making the argument here that Pope St. Pius V made in Quo Primum, where there's all these accretions that have, been added in regions. You think back on the history of Christendom, and we didn't have the communications medium we have now. So there was a lot of regionalizations and things like that. Right. That's not the argument that he's making. He's saying this apostolic liturgy was much more pure and simple. Is that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is where you get something that Pius XII in 1947 actually condemned as, he called it, false antiquarianism. Yeah, exactly. But we can get into that later. So that's one theory, is that there actually was a corruption in the liturgy and needed to be simplified and stripped back, sort of taking the whitewash off to get to the fresco underneath, so to speak. The other theory, the pastoral theory, is basically this: the liturgy exists for the sake of the people who are participating in the liturgy. That is, it's supposed to meet their particular needs, whatever those needs may be. And according to Jungmann and others, the ancient Latin liturgy met the normal, everyday needs of ancient Latin-speaking people. But by the time you got to the late Middle Ages, and the Latin language was only the preserve of the scholars, and the common people were already speaking vernacular Romance languages and so on, it had ceased to be a liturgy for the people. They couldn't relate to it anymore, so it wasn't serving their needs, and therefore. This
was the thesis of the Reformers, that the liturgy exists for man.
Yeah, in many ways, I think if you really want to sort of beat around the bush or not beat around the bush and say what's the bottom line, I think it has a lot to do with a misunderstanding of how the liturgy is for God and how it is for us. But anyway, so the pastoral theory is what led some fairly radical thinkers to say, modern man is not extravagant. He's not given to high formality. He doesn't dress the way that medieval people did anymore. He needs a kind of streamlined, efficient, didactic sort of delivery system of the sacraments, and so
utilitarian.
Well, yeah, it is to a large extent. I think utilitarianism and functionalism really play a large role in this. So that's where you finally end up with people saying, you know what, the Tridentine liturgy is somewhat corrupted and it's completely irrelevant to modern man. And so for both of these reasons, we have to do a radical overhaul.
Ugh.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's so gross.
I know.
I keep thinking back to, I know a mutual favorite author of ours, Martin Mosbach, and his argument for the way, the Catholic liturgy is intended to transcend the quotidian, just this everyday experience. You step into a sacred place, you're challenged to focus on a sacred language. There's just this drawing of the self out of the mundane of everyday life and into something transcendent. And that's just erased with this.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, the liturgy, whenever you look at it, whatever phase of its development, it's always made up of many components, many elements that in their totality are going to strike people as otherworldly and strange and ritual and formal and as something that carries you into the realm of mystery, something that absolutely does not come from out of your own will or your own mind or your own daily experience, but something that's given to you by divine revelation, something that's handed down as a kind of priceless gift, right? And we don't deserve it. We don't fabricate it. We don't even understand all of it. That's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. God, you can't comprehend God. If you comprehend it, it's not God. That's what Augustine says.
Yeah.
And the liturgy should have that numinous quality to it, where you step into the church and the chant begins and the incense is floating in the air and you are wrapped up in God.
Yeah, you're somewhere else.
Yeah, and you pray as well as you can. Nobody's perfect with adoration, supplication, contrition, thanksgiving, and so on. But the liturgy should make those acts easier for us, not more difficult for us. And that's what my main criticism of the Novus Ordo, which is something I'm not like a traditionalist who never goes to the ordinary form. I've been working closely with it for decades, so I know it very, very well, and I know what it's capable of being at its best. But my main complaint has finally crystallized into it's very difficult to pray in the ordinary form. It's just difficult to pray. Even if things are done with decorum, which they're often not, but even if they're done with decorum and the vestments are beautiful and the music is decent or even excellent, the fact is it's so verbose and it's so full of activity of all sorts that you never actually feel like you've prayed. It's very hard to make acts of adoration, thanksgiving, supplication, praise, and so on. Whereas with the old liturgy, paradoxically, right, you're sort of thrown on your own resources. So there's
that's what I was going to say. I mean, the Novus Ordo is a bit patronizing, isn't it? In a way, it's a hand-holding, exercise. It's, this is what we're doing now. This is what we're doing now. Everybody's involved. Whereas when you go to the old Mass, I mean, like you said, you're it's sink or swim. You're on your own. The first time you go, you feel totally alienated if you didn't grow up with it.
Yes.
You have no idea where you are.
No, that's true. In fact, I read an author who made this excellent observation. He said that the Novus Ordo, the reason why Versus Populum has come to be almost identified with the essence of the Novus Ordo, even though we know it's not necessary, is that it's a liturgy where there has to be an animator, somebody who is there in a sense animating the people and making them do stuff in response. And if that animator is not there, the people don't know what to do. They talk to each other or whatever. They don't pray. If you go into a lot of churches, people are not praying before and after Mass. They're just yammering. And the reason is there's no one there sort of instructing them or prompting them or animating them to do something. Whereas in an old Mass, right, you go into it and you have to pray. There's nothing else you can do. I mean, either that or you have to run away screaming.
Twiddle your thumbs. I mean, I'll give you a very crass example, but I'll never forget in college, a seminarian told me about a homily he had heard from his bishop. I don't know if he was at a Chrism Mass, what the occasion was that he was hearing the bishop preach, but he said that the bishop said that the role of the priest is to be sort of the Johnny Carson of the Mass. It's his job to entertain and titillate the faithful.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
And obviously, however widespread that belief may or may not be, this bishop happened to be particularly open about his opinion on this, but that is that sense of, you're in the role of entertainer. You're in Vegas and you're on the stage and you've got the microphone and you're looking at the crowd to see, hey, how are they responding?
Yes.
It's a very different thing than facing God and saying, hey, I'm leading everybody in prayer. Come with me.
Right. No, it's true. When you go to the old Mass, whether it's a high Mass or a low Mass, you have such a strong sense that it's all about God. It's not about you. It's focused on, either God exists or everyone there is crazy, right? Whereas with the Novus Ordo, you could almost get the impression that we're doing this as kind of like a self-help seminar. We're coming together, we're kind of keeping each other company. It's a sociable activity. It's a comfortable thing. Sure, it's a religious event in a general sense. And obviously as Catholics, we believe that it's a sacramental reality as well. But the form of it, the way, the manner of it is really that of what some people have called, moral therapeutic deism. It's not an act of adoration of the triune God and his mystery and the real presence of Christ in the sacrifice.
Well, I remember being a kid and thinking that some of the prayers that we were saying were actually words directed at the priest because he was looking at us, and it was like this back and forth conversation, you know? And I remember, you know, especially because you have that I don't know what you call it, the thing from the Didache that the Protestants say that we've added to the Our Father, that for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory and all that. And I remember thinking we were saying that to the priest, like this aggrandizement of the priest as a kid. And then it struck me as incongruous, like, why are we saying this to the priest? It's kind of a weird thing to say to him.
Yeah. No, I knew.
Just that subtle psychology of being a child. I'm like, well, we're saying it to him, so it must be directed at him, right?
I had a student in college who told me once that as a girl growing up, she was really confused. This is when she was very small, obviously, but she was very confused because the priest was looking at the people, but talking to God. And she couldn't, there was like a cognitive dissonance there.
Right.
And it is a huge cognitive dissonance. So
okay, now this is your first time on the podcast, so you don't know that the greatest pitfall and trap is that I will lead you into a million tangents and we won't cover half the ground we need to in twice the time we should. So I'm going to move us forward, and I want to ask. So you know we've talked about this trajectory of liturgical reform, but then all of a sudden we've got this guy Archbishop Bugnini who shows up on the scene. He is, you know, he's a legendary figure. He's an infamous figure. Allegedly, he's suspected by 2 different popes of being involved in Freemasonry, but somehow he's empowered to not only write the draft of Sacrosanctum Concilium, but also then to take over the concilium that implements that. He's the drafter of the new Mass. He's all this, winds up, you know, living the rest of his days in exile as apostolic nuncio to Tehran, where there are no Catholics. I mean, who is this guy? Where did he come from, and how did he gain so much influence over really the worship of Catholics around the world?
I know it actually is one of the most astonishing stories, I think, in the history of the Church, without a doubt. Bugnini, and I have a friend, by the way, who says that if he ever writes a murder mystery novel, he's going to be sorely tempted to name the arch-villain Annibale Bugnini, because it sounds like a villain's name, doesn't it? but aside from that, which is a superficial observation, this much is clear. Bugnini was what we call a smooth operator. He was extremely competent at his work. He worked insanely. I mean, he was completely passionately devoted to the liturgical reform. He was a megalomaniac. You can see that for sure from his memoirs. He wrote this gigantic volume of memoirs called The Reform of the Liturgy, 1948 to 1975. I have a copy on my shelf. It makes for very eye-opening reading because he kept meticulous notes on everything for that whole period, 1948 to 1975. He came into his first Vatican post in 1948 when he was a lowly secretary for the Liturgical Reform Commission of Pius XII. And he ends the book in 1975, which is not long before his death. But you can see how organized he was, how dedicated he was, and he seems to have believed unflinchingly in his program. I have no reason to think, really, I don't think we need to go down the route of he was a Freemason and he was infiltrating the church and trying to do all of this. I think he just believed, he was a true believer in his own gospel of liturgical reform. He had drunk the Kool-Aid about the corruption theory and the pastoral theory. He said in an impassioned article in the early 70s against the historian Hubert Gedin, he said, finally, millions of Christians can worship God in their own language and they can understand what they're doing and they're liberated. You know, he really believed this, right? So I like to see him more as I said, somebody who really drank the Kool-Aid and who was able, for whatever reason, to keep all sorts of important people wrapped around his little finger. We know that this is true because although he was technically just the main organizer of the concilium was the group that quote unquote reformed the liturgy, deformed it would be a better word. But this group, the concilium, was mostly made up of bishops and theologians, people with much higher credentials than Bugnini had, but he was the organizing principle. He was the one who was always setting up the meetings and keeping people in touch with each other and reporting on progress and so on and so forth. And so he really drove the concilium. And on the other side, right, he had to liaison with Paul VI. And Paul VI, he must have loved him until whatever happened. It's very strange. Nobody knows what happened, but something snapped with Paul VI and Bugnini. There was a period when suddenly the Pope wouldn't talk to him anymore, wouldn't receive him, and then he was packed off to Tehran. So that's why the Freemason theory gets a lot of traction, because it seems like such an obvious explanation, but who knows? I think that it's maybe impossible to know for sure. But yeah, so he would go to Pope. I mean, you know this. Louis Bouillet talks about this in his own memoirs. He saw it first, up close.
That's in his memoirs are in my stack of read books, right next to Resurgent in the Mist of Christ.
Thank you. Let me just tell you what Bouillet discovered once, and this will give you, I think, a perfect sense of how Bugnini must have been, how persuasive he must have been, and how crafty as well, I think is true to say. So there was a particular change that Bugnini wanted to drive through. I forget which change it was to the liturgy of the thousands of changes. And he went to Pope Paul VI and he said, Holy Father, we want to make this change. And the Pope said, really? You want to make that change? And Bugnini said, yes, the whole concilium is behind it. They're all in favor of this change. Oh, okay, then the experts know best. Go ahead and do that. So then Bugnini turns around and goes back to the concilium and says, the Holy Father has requested this change be made. And of course the concilium is saying, what, really? No, the Holy Father insists on it. He really wants this.
Yeah, I've heard this is how he played the game, yeah.
No, he did. And although we have only one reported episode of that, if it happened once, it could have happened 100 times. And maybe it was the discovery that he'd been played that caused Paul VI to send Bugnini away. I mean, that would, from my point of view, if I found out that I'd been played many times, that would be plenty of reason, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and Paul VI, I mean, let's face it, he's a complete enigma to everybody. But I mean, there are all these reports that he was stunned when he realized the changes that he had allowed. And even in his own speeches, I mean, he says things about, what an annoyance the new mass is, something along those lines. I mean, he uses language that it doesn't fit with a guy who's at the wheel.
Yeah, you're right. I think Paul VI is, he is an enigma. For one thing, it's well known when you read biographies of Paul VI that he was extremely indecisive. He even compared himself once to Hamlet. He was very uncertain at times about the way to go. He didn't have that quality of generalship, if I could put it that way, that you can see in John Paul II. You can see it in a gentler way in Benedict XVI. And I think you can see it in Pope Francis, frankly. I mean, that is, these are men who know what they want, know how to get it, and are just relentless at pursuing it. Paul VI was not that way. It was like what day of the week or what month of the year it was, you could see a different face and a different policy. And so I think that's true. There was something I was going to say about Paul VI. Particularly. Oh, right. So you're referring to these audiences they're amazing. The audiences, there are several of them, especially right before the promulgation or the implementation of the new missal, where he says, this new way of praying the Mass is going to disturb all kinds of people, including especially the pious, who are used to going to Mass and being enveloped in silence and just praying, but now we're going to summon you out of your shell. We're going to make you interact and speak. And this is going to be very difficult at first, but eventually it will be for the common good of the church. So he's making this.
But I mean, he actually uses this language. I looked it up while you were talking. He says, we shall become aware, perhaps with some feeling of annoyance, that the ceremonies at the altar are no longer being carried out with the same words and gestures to which we are accustomed, perhaps so much accustomed that we no longer took any notice of them, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. We must prepare for this many-sided inconvenience.
Yes.
It is the kind of upset caused by every novelty that breaks in on our habits. We shall notice that pious persons are disturbed most. Pious persons are disturbed most because they have their own respectable way of hearing Mass, and they will feel shaken out of their usual thoughts and obliged to follow those of others. Even priests may feel some annoyance in this respect. This was his address addressed to a general audience, November 26, 1969.
Yeah, that's right. That was the first weekend of Advent, 1969, when the missal came into force.
And I mean, so clearly he was aware of what a departure it was.
Oh yeah, and in fact, it's absurd. It's absurd when people object to traditionalists calling the new Mass or the Novus Ordo. Sometimes you hear people objecting to that. Oh no, you should call it the ordinary form or the Missal of Paul VI or whatever. Well, he's the one who says over and over again, this is new, this is novel, this is an innovation, and he uses the very phrase Novus Ordo. He uses that phrase. So we're just following Pope Paul VI when we speak this way. But yeah, another example of the rupture, really the hermeneutic of rupture that Benedict XVI talked about, is when Paul VI gets up and says, you know what? The Church has been using Latin for centuries. She's been singing Gregorian chant for centuries. But now, in order to penetrate into modern man, finally to make this sort of pastoral leap, you can hear the echoes of Jungmann there. We have to give up these priceless treasures. That's what he says. That's a quotation. We have to give up these priceless treasures in order to reach modern man. It hasn't worked. It's patently obvious that it hasn't worked. Right. But it's you can really see he is an enigma. Because he's also the Pope of the Credo of the People of God, which is an Orthodox profession of faith. He's the Pope of Humanae Vitae. So, it's not as if he's a Pope Francis. I mean, he obviously did
the Pope of Mysterium Fidei. I mean, there's a number of things that he did.
Well, he even defended private masses. The idea of a priest getting up at a side altar and celebrating Mass by himself, which was one of the things the liturgical reformers hated. That was especially dark and medieval. He defended that in the encyclical Mysterium Fidei.
Well, that's still pointed to the idea that Mass was about God. We can't have that.
Exactly.
So let me ask you this. So the reform goes, way beyond even what Vatican II called for, even with Bugnini driving the ship, even with, this revolution that happened when they tossed out all the preparatory schema. Nobody still knows why John the 23rd, after, the vote was cast and he was talking about how great the work that they had done for the last 3 years. Next thing you know, everything's thrown out and there's a whole new agenda for the council. Even still, the liturgical reform that comes after pushes beyond what the council fathers saw coming. And they were ready for a lot of change, clearly. Why is there no pushback? Where did the bishops just lay down and die? I mean, what happened?
Yeah. It's to me, it's one of the hugest tragedies of the 20th century that, it was a perfect storm. Really, to understand what happened after Vatican II, you have to roll back to 1870, the First Vatican Council, and the definition of papal infallibility. At the time, as you know, there were people objecting to the definition of papal infallibility, not because they didn't think that there were times when the Pope was infallible, and not that they didn't believe that the Pope had the ultimate jurisdiction and the final call in a doctrinal dispute, but because they were afraid of how it would be misinterpreted and misapplied and the kind of habits of thinking that it would promote. And one of these objectors, it wasn't just Dollinger and Acton and the people who went off with the so-called old Catholics into schism, but it was John Henry Newman, right, the great eminent church historian and the theologian of the development of doctrine, who looked at that and said, obviously I've got to swallow what the council says, but I think this is imprudent, and I think that that evils are going to come of this. So what came from Vatican I and from the whole sort of ultramontanist spirit of the 19th century, which is understandable, right? In a period of anti-clerical revolution, everybody sort of gathers around the popes who were so vehemently anti-liberal and anti-modern and anti-revolutionary, right? So they were exactly the opposite of what we've been seeing more recently. Nevertheless, this spirit of ultramontanism led to a kind of mentality among the episcopacy where the bishops are just essentially the Pope's, they're the Pope's secretaries, they're the Pope's liegemen. I mean, whatever the Pope says they're going to do, they're just company men, right? You could put it that way.
Right. Yeah.
The thought, I mean, when you study medieval history, or even better, ancient church history. I mean, there are times when bishops say to the Pope, "Get lost. We don't agree with you," or where they have real discussions, real debates, real difficulties, because they don't think the Pope is a sort of walking Delphic oracle who is just the mouthpiece of all truth and all prudence. Right? They will actually take him to task if they disagree with him. That's almost unimaginable now. And this, personally, I think this is why what the four cardinals did with the dubia is both a breath of fresh air and a cause of distress. It's a breath of fresh air because these cardinals are acting like people with independent judgment who have the faith and who are willing to stand up for it, regardless of, even if it's the Pope himself who's saying something different. But it's a cause of distress because they're so isolated. It's like everybody's been lobotomized. Nobody is willing to actually stand up and say, I don't understand what you're saying, I don't agree with what you're saying, or whatever. So getting back to the liturgical reform,
it goes back to that quote from Melchior Cano, who is the bishop and theologian at the Council of Trent, who said Peter has no need of our lies or flattery.
Yeah, exactly.
Those who blindly and indiscriminately defend every action and decision of the Supreme Pontiff are the very ones who do the most to undermine the authority of the Holy See.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true. I mean, I think part of the reason, this is a bit of a digression, and I'll get back to your question, but I think part of the reason...
I am the master of digression.
I think part of the reason why the church has become so politicized, that is, that people think of themselves first and foremost as liberal or conservative or progressive or traditional or whatever, is that the popes themselves have in a sense personalized their office and they sort of give it a flavor and a certain direction. I mean, instead of just being sort of anonymous papal figures who just stand up as a barrier against all innovation and heresy, which is what they're supposed to do. They sort of have their own individual flavor and style, and therefore people are going to be for or against that, and it politicizes the whole situation. But getting back to your question, I mean, I say it's tragic because there were over 2,000 prelates present at the Second Vatican Council. I've read the speeches that they gave about the liturgy, and there are a few of them who bring up surprisingly radical ideas, the kind of ideas you'd associate with a Jungmann or even or people who were pushing the corruption and pastoral theories. But for the most part, the speeches were very conservative. A bishop would stand up and say, we need to add a little bit more scripture to the missal. They didn't ask for a complete overhaul of the lectionary, but let's just add some more to the readings. Or can we have some of the Mass in the vernacular rather than all of it in Latin? And so when you look at Sacrosanctum Concilium, as you said, it's a fairly conservative document. It has problems, but my goodness, if we actually were following what that document says, the world would be a much better place. So it finally came out saying Latin is the normative language of the Roman Rite. It will remain so. It came out saying that Gregorian chant is the music proper to the Roman Rite, should take precedence. And this is what the over 2,000 prelates voted for, including Paul VI as Montini, as the Archbishop of Milan. And so then a few years later, when change after change after change is coming down from the Vatican, it seems to me that the only explanation you can give, well, there are a couple. One is that a lot of these bishops were already elderly when they attended the council, and some of them were ending their careers. Some of them had already been replaced after the council by younger people who had the sort of sporty ideas that were going around. And so many of them, I think, might have just felt kind of tired and powerless. Like, okay, if this is what is coming down, then I guess this is what we're supposed to do. They were not in a mood to fight. In other words, they were not. The only one who fought was Lefebvre, right? He was the only one who said, I cannot accept this. This goes against every instinct I have as a Catholic. No,
Which
that's not
goes
true.
to show
That's not
that
true,
things
by the
were-
way. He wasn't the only one. There were a few, but go ahead.
But I mean, I was just going to say, it goes to show that things were pretty far gone by this point for them to not even put up a fight.
Yes, and then if you really want an incredible example of the torment that a lot of the bishops must have been feeling, you can look at Cardinal Heenan from England. Cardinal Heenan is somebody whom all traditionalists admire. We all have a soft spot for him because even though he also buckled under pressure, he felt he had to. I think that was because of the ultramontanism, right? If the Pope wants it, then we all have to do it. But he couldn't stand the changes that were coming in. They also rubbed him the wrong way. And you know, there's a famous exchange of letters between Evelyn Waugh and Cardinal Heenan. It's published in a book called A Bitter Trial from Ignatius Press. I highly recommend it. It's not a long book, but these are really interesting letters. They're from the early 60s, like 63 to 66 or so, when there were already a bunch of disconcerting changes happening, and this is certainly well before the Novus Ordo, but you know, the Mass being said versus populum, the canon being said aloud in English, you know, all these sorts of things were happening already. Every year was a new chaos. Every year was bringing new changes, and Evelyn Waugh was complaining bitterly about these things, and eloquently, as always for Waugh. And Cardinal Heenan was writing these private letters to him saying, "I sympathize with what you're saying. I know what you're saying." You know, and he kept reassuring him, "Oh, things won't change anymore. They've changed now as much as they need to." And then there would be yet another change, right? So Cardinal Heenan was a man, essentially, from what I can tell, I haven't read a biography of him, but he was a man who he was personally strong in his faith and in his devotion to tradition, but he was weak when it came to being a public figure, and he would never have publicly disagreed with the Pope, right? So here's a man who was basically, he was crucified internally over this stuff. And the one final great thing he did for the cause of tradition was he was involved in getting that indult by which elderly priests in England and Wales were permitted to continue celebrating the Old Mass. That's something that Bugnini and other people in Rome were dead set against. But because of Heenan's friendship with Pope Paul VI, he was able to get that done. And what that means, incidentally, is that because of England, and also there are scattered priests all over, but especially because of England, there's never been a time when the Old Mass has stopped being celebrated.
I was going to say, it's funny how this sort of backdoor continuity, you know, continues.
Oh yeah, and that's important too for this reason. And I haven't seen this talked about enough by people, but I think it's important. There's a common understanding of theologians that any act of the magisterium that is from the Holy Spirit will be accepted by the whole people of God. And obviously what that means is not numerically everybody, because there could be heretics or schismatics who say, goodbye, I'm leaving. But it's got to be accepted by the faithful as a whole, in some recognizable fashion, in order to say, yes, this is completely from God. And when you look at Pius V and Quo Primum and the implementation of the so-called Tridentine Mass or Tridentine Missal, that particular edition of the Roman Missal, he, of course, made an exception for certain older rites, but he said, you know, the people are free to choose this missal. Some people have to use this missal. Some people are free to vote to use this missal. But in any case, within a matter of 100 years, everybody was either using that missal or they were using their older rites that they had permission to use, or their older uses. With the Missal of Paul VI, it was never universally accepted. And in fact, the number of clergy who are not using it and only using the old Missal is growing. With every passing year, that number is growing. So I think it's impossible at this point to say that the Missal of Paul VI enjoys the kind of unanimous reception from the people of God and that the sensus fidelium would require. So,
well, and I think that it's also fair to say that it's not ever been implemented in a standardized way. It's just, you know, I refer to it as parish roulette, but I mean, if you're ever traveling,
Yes.
and you just go to a random parish, or just, I mean, in your own town, pick, you don't have a lot of options out there in Wyoming, but I mean, if you live in a city and you just pick a different parish at random every Sunday, your experience will be totally different from one Sunday to the next.
See,
there's never been a standard implementation.
Right. And you know what? I should actually bring in another point connected with the pastoral theory, almost like a corollary of it, is a certain understanding of the fashionable term enculturation. So if you look at the writings of the more radical liturgists from the 60s, 70s, what they believed is that the idea of having a preset formal ritual where the words are scripted and the gestures are scripted and so on is artificial and will prevent Christianity from sort of merging and molding all the different world cultures that it's going to come into contact with in Africa and in Asia and with the Aborigines and wherever the missionaries are going to go. Of course, the number of missionaries dropped by, like 1,000-fold after the Second Vatican Council. But so let's say there were missionaries. So in any case, the idea of enculturation here is the Mass actually has to be completely customized to every particular group of people. That's kind of the end game, as it were. The Novus Ordo is like a halfway house to the end game of a totally enculturated, particularized, individualized liturgy. And I'm not making this up. Ratzinger talks about it in his book, A New Song for the Lord. In that's a very, very important book. He covers this. He shows that what I'm saying right now is exactly what you can read in standard Italian books of liturgical theology. And so what you're saying about Parish Roulette, that's not by accident. That's not by chance. This is why the Novus Ordo has so many options in it. It's designed to move in that direction of total enculturation as they understand it.
So I want to touch on that. You have a term for that, optionitis, but I want to hit on a couple points first. So, sure. Okay, so we have this liturgical reform. The Missal is, essentially promulgated initially in 1969, right? So, within a matter of weeks, in a lot of places, everything's different. Now, I don't know how they managed to do it that fast. It was like a fait accompli. I mean, it's interesting. There's this parish in the Arlington Diocese in Northern Virginia where the Latin Mass is now done. St. John the Beloved in McLean. And it's interesting because if I remember correctly, the cornerstone on this parish is 1954 is the date, but it's a spaceship church built in the round.
Yep.
And you're thinking this is 10, 15 years before the new Mass, which even made Versus Populum a thing. I mean, how were they doing the liturgy in these churches? And I don't know how many of them were built in the 50s, but I mean, it was already, they were rearing to go on this.
Oh, yeah. No, it's true. I mean, let me just mention something. I hope I won't... I hope I won't scandalize too many listeners by saying this, but I mean, I have a great admiration for Romano Guardini, the German theologian whom Ratzinger considered to be his sort of theological mentor. And Guardini, his book on sacred signs and his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, these are just gems. They're beautiful books that I would unequivocally recommend. But Guardini was doing weird stuff too. I mean, all the way back, if you can believe this, all the way back in the 1920s, he was doing Versus Populum masses with university students, because people like him who were steeped in the pseudo scholarship that was available at that time, they really were convinced that the early Christians celebrated Mass in this kind of Jewish/Roman table fellowship model, where people were all sitting around the Passover table, kind of like the neo-cats do nowadays.
Which recent scholarship has more or less proven to be false, has it not?
Oh yeah, it's blown it out of the water. I mean, there's no question that early on the Christian liturgy was, so to speak, oriented. Especially, there's no question that the Christian liturgy was celebrated in an eastward fashion once the Christians were using basilicas. There's no question about that. But prior to it would have been very strange for Christians who had been celebrating Mass in a different way for a couple of centuries, suddenly to pop up into the basilicas and begin to celebrate in a totally different way. So, in other words, the most likely thing is that the way they were celebrating after Constantine liberalized Christianity was the way that they were celebrating when they were in secret as well.
Right.
It matches with a lot of ancient texts and archaeological finds. But anyway, in the 1920s, it was possible to think, even as a responsible scholar, to be persuaded that this isn't the way it was in the ancient church, and therefore with university students, you're trying to reach them in a new way, in a deeper way, as you think it, that you want to engage them more, all these sorts of things that you can think of. So Guardini was doing that in spite of him being such an eminent theologian, having such wonderful thoughts about the liturgy. So I guess the reason I bring up Guardini is because if even he can succumb to this kind of modern current of we've got to change things all over the place, then what about the rest of us, right? I mean, how are the rest of us supposed to fare?
Yeah, and I mean, I would assume that this topic of how the liturgy was implemented worldwide in such a short period of time with so little resistance. I mean, a lot of people left, thousands of people left the church.
Yeah.
But they didn't push back. They just kind of said, well, I guess this isn't what I thought it was. I guess Catholicism isn't, which is weird.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I wanted to make the point, too, when I was talking about the Sensus Fidelium and the reception of the new liturgy by the faithful, that after the Council of Trent, there was not a mass exodus from the church. In fact, there was a great increase in the power of the church and the numbers of faithful, especially through the New World missions, of course. But there was the acceptance of the liturgy and the growth of the church. After the council, people voted with their feet. I mean, there are countless. We all know this. We know people who knew people who said, "I'm not going to that anymore."
And I've heard it. I mean, I've heard it from the pulpit from priests who had their own siblings and family members.
Oh, sure. So I mean, so that's another sign that the faithful didn't receive this, right? I mean, if all of them had stuck around and enthusiastically participated in the rite of Paul VI, then it would be a lot harder for a traditionalist to make his case, But
well, I mean, Quo Primum, the reform of Quo Primum was a standardization of the liturgy. I mean, it wasn't an overhaul, right?
It wasn't. No, it was it's one of the most mendacious moves that's made by modern liturgical scholars when they say, look, what Paul VI was doing was just what Pope Pius V was doing. Absolutely not. That's absurd. Pius V took the Roman Rite as he had inherited it, and he did a little bit of pruning to it. Well, okay, the sequences took a big hit, and that's perhaps a sad thing. But the canon of the Mass, he didn't touch that. He wouldn't have dreamed of touching that. The propers of the Mass, the lectionary of lessons and gospels, the calendar in its basic form there, all of those things remained totally untouched. It was
for example, the regional stuff that crept in, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And the sequences, right? I mean, I'm sure that as somebody who loves the old liturgy, you like me, enjoy seeing those sequences when they come up, the Stabat Mater and the Veni Sancte Spiritus this weekend for Pentecost.
I'm too busy walking a screaming kid when those are being sung. So I might appreciate those in another 10 or 15 years.
Someday you will. But, before Pius V, the liturgy was just loaded with sequences. I mean, they were practically a weekly feature. And, in his reform, he said, we are going to go back to a somewhat earlier form of this rite before a number of these things were added. So there's the generic similarity of the idea of pruning away some accretions, some additions. Accretions is the fancy word that has a sort of pejorative connotation, and additions would just be a neutral way of putting it. And so one could say, well, it's too bad that he pruned some of those beautiful medieval poems, but fundamentally the whole liturgy was still the same, right? It was like taking a few ornaments off the Christmas tree. What happened with the Concilium was vastly different. That was like chucking out the Christmas tree and getting another Christmas tree
and setting it on fire.
Yeah, well, sure, for good measure.
All right, so let me ask you this. We're at an hour into this conversation. I'm good to go for a few more questions if you are, but I don't know how much time you have. So.
Oh, sure. Let's go for a little while.
All right. So let's fast forward. So we have this sea change of liturgy and of the worship experience for the vast majority of Catholics who are in the Latin Rite. Over a period of less than 2 months, this gets rolled out and suddenly everybody's going to a different mass. And for some people, they like it more. For others, they don't. But what winds up happening is the normative experience for not just century, but really over a millennium, is gone. It's just gone. And you bring up, Cardinal Heenan, and there's the indult for priests in England. And then you have, the Agatha Christie indult, which is an interesting story in its own right. And You have these stories that I've never actually seen documentation on, that saints like Padre Pio and Jose Maria Escriva both got permission to continue saying the Old Mass. So you see this sort of, this is going on in pockets. The Old Mass is continuing, but until 1988 and the Episcopal consecrations done by Archbishop Lefebvre without the mandate from Rome, and then the excommunications and the formation of the Fraternity of St. Peter, you're looking at almost 20 years of really a wasteland where the Mass, the Old Mass, is essentially impossible to find. Mm-hmm. And then you get the indult, where the Pope says, if people want it, give it to them. The bishops kind of, I remember one of my first experiences before I even started going to the traditional Mass. I just started to be interested in it, and I went to a conference put on by Latin Mass magazine. And it was Father James McLucas, who was the editor at the time of the magazine, mentioned this conversation between, I forget who it was, that was sort of the Pope's liaison to the bishops on this. It may have been Cardinal Castellan Hoyos. I don't remember who it was. But basically going to one of these bishops and saying, look, it's the will of the Holy Father that you allow the people in your diocese to have this Mass. And the bishop responded, well, the Pope is not the Pope of my diocese, is he? I'm going to make this decision for myself. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so there was this real, this hammering, this pushback during this period of the indult. And it was this ghettoization that happened of traditional Catholics. I think it's what led to a lot of the bitterness that people see and complain about now. And I'm skimming here because I want to get to the meat of, so then out of the blue, in 2007, we get this motu proprio letter, Summorum Pontificum, that essentially validates the arguments that traditional Catholics had made all along, that the Mass was never abrogated, that it can't be just dispensed with. I mean, it was sort of a neutron bomb.
Yes.
Did anybody see it coming?
Yes. Well, yes, absolutely. One of the things that Archbishop Lefebvre had requested, and his successor, Bishop Fillet, had requested of the Pope, was the lifting of the excommunications, which they considered to be ineffective anyway, but they wanted the gesture of the lifting of them, the restoration of the right of all priests to celebrate the Old Mass, and I think the third thing they were asking for was the right to criticize the formulations of the Second Vatican Council. And Pope Benedict actually gave them all of those things. So, I mean, the ideas had been floating for a while. All the way back in the 1980s, in the late 80s, you can find Ratzinger saying that he is, that the Church ought to consider making these kinds of gestures, these overtures, in order for, to reconcile and to, and basically to make a course correction from the extreme sort of amnesia of tradition that had been enforced to a more, as Ratzinger would see it, a more balanced assimilation of things new and old. I mean,
and boy, did he catch hell for it too.
Yeah, of course. And and ultimately, Ratzinger is a dialectical thinker, by which I mean he, to the disappointment perhaps of traditionalists, he's finally speaking, he's not a traditionalist. He's somebody who just wants there to be in this great big house of the church room for everybody and room for everything that is consistent with canon law. So he'd be against liturgical dancers with pink balloons because that's against liturgical law. But he would be in favor of everybody doing more or less what they would like to do as long as it's within those confines. But that meant, of course, that he wanted to be fair to people who love the Latin liturgical heritage. And he said very forcefully multiple times, a church is calling its very identity into question if it says that what was its holiest and most precious possession is suddenly forbidden and even indecent to seek for. Right? I mean, he said things like that on multiple occasions. So he saw the problem. He saw the problem of rupture, and he worked as hard as he could to overcome rupture in a kind of pragmatic way, right? A live and let live way. But yeah, no, I mean, so in that sense, people...
It's the don't ask, don't tell policy of liturgy.
Sure. I think it goes to maybe to a certain mentality or temperament that doesn't want to impose, but wants to propose, wants to set a good example and let, in a sense, market forces determine how things are going to work out. I mean, obviously, market forces under the influence of the Holy Spirit. So, in other words, let the old Mass be free, deregulate it, and see how it does on the open market.
I wish the Holy Spirit were the only spirit at work.
Exactly. Well, and this much I think is true. On the one hand, if every diocese had regularly and easily available Latin masses, the movement would grow by leaps and bounds. There's no question about that. On the other hand, I think we have to be realistic and say at this point and for the foreseeable future, it isn't as if all Catholics would just switch over. They would just sort of run with joy to grab their mantillas and their missals and go and kneel for an hour. I mean, that's not going to happen right now. But it is true that there are a lot of artificial limitations on the movement.
It's both. I mean, it's a conscious choice. The first 3 times I went to the traditional Mass, I couldn't stand it. I mean, I was raised with this other liturgy, and yes. I have always... My subjective impression has been that the Novus Ordo, in a way, inoculates you against the traditional liturgy.
Yeah.
You go in there and you feel alienated and you feel ignored and you feel lost and you feel that this is not, anything that's familiar to you at all.
Yes.
It's that sense of alienation is profound when, particularly if you're a cradle Catholic. And, you're at the point where I was in, high school and college when I first started to run into the TLM every once in a while. And I knew the Mass, the Novus Ordo. I mean, I could recite it from memory. I was an altar boy. I mean, I knew it inside and out. And here I am at this Mass, and I'm told that this is the Catholic Mass. And I'm like, I've never seen anything like this. Yeah. Even at the Byzantine liturgy, I felt more comfortable because it was in English and it felt more approachable and it was audible, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's true.
So it really does, I think, and the difference is my wife, who's a convert from sort of a nominal Protestantism and not even that, the first time, and she'd been Catholic for maybe a year. I don't even think it was that long. And a TLM started at the end of the Mass that we went to on Sunday, and she didn't want to leave. She said she wouldn't even look at me. Her eyes were just wrapped on the altar, and she just said, this is what Mass is. This is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
No, and she recognizes it immediately.
It's true. It's yeah. I think that some people do have that immediate sort of assimilation or reaction to it, and others it takes a while. But to get back to Benedict XVI, there was actually a commission.
This was this profound moment, and you're just staying on task.
Oh, sorry. No. But I have to say this, because Summorum Pontificum didn't really come out of nowhere in this respect. There was a commission of cardinals that John Paul II put together, I want to say like 20 years before Summorum Pontificum came out. And the question put before this commission of cardinals was, did Paul VI technically, legally abrogate the old missal or the old Mass? Did he make it so that it's no longer the Roman Rite.
Yeah, and that's an important word for people listening who don't know the word abrogate. What does it mean?
Yeah, so, oh goodness, it does get pretty quickly complicated because canon lawyers make a distinction between abrogation, abrogation, and derogation, and I'm not going to try to go into all that.
You know too much. That's the problem.
But I'm surprised they haven't killed me yet. So abrogation basically means to put something away forever, to replace it. So if Paul VI had abrogated the Missal of Pius V as it was subsequently amended down to John the 23rd, then he would essentially have been replacing it utterly with his own missal.
And it has a legal connotation. I mean, it's...
Yeah, the legal connotation is that it's not... I don't even know if you might even have to say that it's invalid that doesn't really make sense, but certainly it would be illicit to use an abrogated.
Yeah, and you
missal.
wouldn't have seen, for example, indults. I mean, it seems incongruous to have something abrogated, but yeah, by the way, a few people can still do it.
So what it seems, the best explanation I can give is, it seems that I heard a canon lawyer make this distinction, and I think it's a very important one, although it's very subtle. It's like angels dancing on a pin. But it's one thing to talk about the right to... It's one thing to talk about the standing of a certain missal or liturgical book, and it's another thing to ask whether a given priest has the right to use that liturgical book. So actually, it's not such a subtle distinction. I mean, you can look at, say, a Byzantine liturgical book, a missal, and say that's a perfectly valid and licit right for a Byzantine priest, but a Roman Catholic priest does not have the right to use that missal.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so what this canon lawyer heard was saying, and he's sympathetic to us, our side, is that Paul VI successfully took away the right of priests to use the old missal, but he did not actually retire the old missal itself. So the old missal was in a kind of cryogenic freezer. It was sort of, it was like it had been put up on the top shelf. It was still there, but it was behind locked glass, and you had to get permission to use it. Okay. And what Summorum Pontificum...
Such a weird thing to do.
It is. But what Summorum Pontificum said was, this missal was never abrogated, which is exactly the point I just made. The missal had never been formally demoted, right? But now all clergy everywhere, I established that they have the right to use this missal. And so you notice that Summorum Pontificum does do something. It actually gives priests universally a right to use this missal, which missal had never been abrogated.
It clears out that problem with the bishop saying, hey, it's my diocese,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and notice, incidentally, that the bishop who said that was suddenly acting like the old-fashioned bishops who were taking charge of their own dioceses and not just being party men. It's funny when
collegiality goes away when a hobby horse comes to town.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let me ask you this: a couple of practical things from Summorum Pontificum. The first is this: Pope Benedict is widely quoted. It was actually from his introduction, I think, to Youngman's book. Criticizing in pretty harsh terms the Novus Ordo as a fabricated liturgy, a banal, on-the-spot product. This quote floats around the internet constantly. He issues Summorum Pontificum. He frees the Mass, but never offers it himself in a public way that would have given enormous support, even if he had done it just once, enormous support to those who are attached to the liturgy. Why do you think that is?
Sure. I read recently, I hope you don't mind if I do something that's going to sound like a plug, but a new book of mine is coming out shortly, in just a few weeks, that listeners might want to know about. It's called Noble Beauty, Transcendent Holiness, Why the Modern Age Needs the Mass of Ages.
I'll do you one better. If you give me a link, I'll put it into the show notes.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. But the reason I mention this book is not just shameless advertising, but because it has a foreword by Martin Mosebach.
Okay.
And in this foreword, Mosebach, and I'm honored and delighted to have a substantial essay by Mosebach at the beginning.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
But in this essay, Mosebach talks a lot about why Pope Benedict XVI did what he did and didn't do what he didn't do. And I think his analysis is right on target. He basically says Pope Benedict XVI was more keenly aware than perhaps anyone else of the dangers of the papal personality project, if I could put it that way, PPP. That is, he was very aware of the danger of the cult of personality and the sort of like imposition,
celebrity papacy.
and the imposition of the will of a given pope on the people, which is just going to encourage the next pope to try to impose his will on the people, and then it just becomes this huge tug of war, and he wanted, in other words, he wanted to create legal structures and give the freedom, all the permissions, all the freedom necessary for people who want to do the right thing to do the right thing. But he wasn't going to try to push it with his personal influence in such a way that it could end up being identified as just his pet project, right? Oh yeah, that's Ratzinger's thing, but now that he's not Pope. I mean, people already try to do this, right? Now that Ratzinger isn't the Pope, they try to say, well, certain things he was doing, that was just because of who he was. But I think he guarded against that very carefully. He didn't demand that everybody go back to Ad Orientem, as much as we would have loved that. He didn't demand that everybody give communion on the tongue to kneeling faithful, but he did those things himself, right? He set good examples, and so we can sort of, I think we can bemoan the limitations of that approach, and yet we can recognize that there's a kind of wisdom to it as well.
Well, I mean, here's the other practical question. I don't know if I'm satisfied with your answer, but
I don't know if I am either, but
I mean, because I don't think, it's a debate we don't need to have right now, but I don't think it's an imposition to say, I think this is a good enough thing that I'm going to give the example.
Sure.
And then, maybe it's not what he does all the time.
Yeah,
but
so you're asking,
but it's right. A legitimization. He's saying,
you're right.
I'm legitimizing this with my own actions.
You're right. I need to answer your specific question about why he didn't celebrate publicly the Old Mass. I read a really good article that, again, this might not sound like a persuasive answer to you, but I read a really good article that described in detail what it was like to do a papal liturgy before Paul VI abolished the old rite, the old papal rite. The papal rite was way more complicated even than a pontifical mass. I mean, when we go to a pontifical mass today with Archbishop Sample or Cardinal Burke, we're just blown away by how elaborate it is and how beautiful and how complicated and so on. But apparently that pales in comparison to the papal rite. And so this author was actually opining that Pope Benedict XVI wouldn't just come out one day and do like a plain pontifical mass, because that's actually not the tradition of the church. The tradition of the church would have been something quite different than that. And all the structures that would have had to be created, and I mean like, scads and scads of extra ministers and offices that don't even exist anymore and stuff. So it could genuinely have been a sense that of the difficulty of the restoration of the papal rite, in the current circumstances. It's not as easy even as for a bishop to go and do a pontifical mass. So I don't know.
That is the most interesting thesis I've heard. So food for thought. All right, let me ask you this. So here we are now, and we have these two forms of the Mass competing side by side. I'm not a fan of the terms extraordinary and ordinary form for my own reasons, but these are the terms we've been given. So we've got these two. How does that work in the long run? How does this marketplace of ideas, or just the marketplace in general of liturgies, how does that work?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the $1 million question. I think that there could be a day 50 years from now when the terminology of ordinary and extraordinary looks like some kind of quaint, old-fashioned, somewhat embarrassing construct from our period, sort of the way we look at bell bottoms and things from the 1970s now. That could very well be. I mean, there's certainly demographic evidence in some parts of the world, I'm thinking of France in particular, that would suggest that within So right now, the number of traditional priests being ordained in France, that is, priests who will exclusively celebrate the Old Mass, either in communion with Rome or not in communion with Rome, that number is getting pretty close to being the same as the number of the ordinary diocesan clergy, because the French church is just dying. It's just plummeting.
Yeah. You see
so
those videos of them demolishing churches there, and it breaks my heart.
It is heartbreaking. And so if these numbers continue and the diocesan numbers go down, and the traditional clergy numbers go steadily up, granted, we're still not talking about huge numbers, but it is a steady climb. If these numbers hold, then in 50 years, if you want to go to Mass in France, it's probably going to be a traditional Mass. Now, France is definitely the most extreme example of that in the world. But if that could happen in France, something like it could happen elsewhere too. In other words, I wouldn't put it past, it's not out of the realm of possibility that we will get to a stage, let's say, where our children or our grandchildren are just, they're just, the Old Mass is just simply something available all over the place, and nobody even thinks twice about it. That's possible. I mean, of course, there's a lot of opposition to that scenario, but at the end of the day, you see this in the better American bishops. They would rather have, the better bishops would rather have Catholics going to church, to an Old Mass, than not going to church at all. And they'd rather ordain a man who wants to celebrate the Latin Mass than not at all, than not ordain somebody. So I think that if you just have enough bishops with their heads screwed on, with their hearts in the right place, we could see, quite a significant turnaround in the whole situation in the next few decades. I know that's a long time to talk about, but these things take a long time. Nothing is overnight. They do. Nothing is overnight.
So I have more questions that I think we're going to get to. We're going to have to split this into another podcast, but there are a couple more things. But if you're willing to come back, we can break some of these off, I think.
Oh, sure. Sure. We can do another one.
But there are a couple things I want to hit. We're coming up on the 90-minute mark, so we probably should wind it down because this is a heavy topic and I don't want to overwhelm people. But I do want to ask some practical questions. If somebody wants to get a Latin Mass started at their parish, I mean, because this is still a thing, we're not seeing a lot of growth now. In fact, I've actually heard rumors, I don't know if they're true, that a lot of bishops are actually becoming more resistant again.
Yeah, I think that's true.
To allowing the Latin Mass. But if somebody does want to try to pursue this, and I hear from people all the time who write in and say, I can't get to one. There isn't one within 3 hours of my house. What do I do? How do they get it started at their parish? What's the first step?
Yeah. The first step is... ultimately, hammering people over the head with Summorum Pontificum is of limited efficacy. And this has just been seen time and time again. So
you're not just supposed to print it out, wrap it around a brick, and throw it.
Exactly. Well, that's been tried and found wanting. So, so I think the most important thing is to find a priest who you think might be, or whom is open in some fashion to traditional things. Maybe there's a priest who actually likes chant, or there's a priest who has said something that leads you to believe that, I don't know, he reads homiletic and pastoral review or whatever. So you have to try to find a priest who's going to be sympathetic to the question, because if you've got a priest who's completely dead set against it, you could try, but it's going to be like kicking a brick wall, right? Kicking that brick instead of wrapping. Anyway, all right. So I think that so you have to find a priest who's even a candidate for learning how to celebrate the Mass, because if there's no priest, there's no Mass, right? So that's what it's about. And then I think that it's better to talk to him in person first, rather than writing a letter, kind of a cold letter out of the blue that says, we'd like you to do the Old Mass. Because if you're in person, you can talk about various things. You can bring up the question. You can try to make some persuasive arguments. This is very important too. It's very important to know that there are a bunch of people who want it, who would be willing to say or even sign their name to a piece of paper that says we would like to have the usus antiquior in our community. And so when you bring it up in person, I had an experience where I talked to a priest for quite a while before he warmed up to the idea, and then he did, and he learned the Mass, and now he's celebrating it. So I think that it's important to cultivate that personal relationship. I know this takes time. It's not like a silver bullet solution, but I think once you get even some kind of little little opening of interest, then I think you can go to, well, Father, I'd like, there are actually 20 of us, and here's a list of our names so that you can have our names and our phone numbers. And, we're ready to pay for you. We'll send you to the Fraternity of St. Peter or the Canons of St. John Cantius for training. We'll buy you the missal. We'll buy you a maniple. We'll get you everything you need. And just be as generous and friendly and respectful and positive as possible.
Just make it as easy as you can.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't, priests, this much is something that I think a lot of the faithful don't realize this as much as they should, but many priests are strapped really thin nowadays. I mean, they're stretched thin. They've got, they're sometimes caring for multiple parish communities or whatever it might be. And they have their own crosses to bear. Sometimes I know many of them have issues with the bishops, that they're not going to tell us about, but that's weighing on them, So we just have to be patient and recognize that if we get a lack of interest or even a no at first, that's not necessarily the end of the story. We can keep working on that. But yeah, I don't know how helpful that is. It's just, there does come a point, I think, where it's good to ask a priest if he's read Summorum Pontificum and to have a copy ready to hand him. And for that purpose, I mean, I just want to mention there is this, I have this website. I was involved in setting up this website called univocewyoming.org. It's for the Univoce chapter in our diocese. Mm-hmm. And when we created the website a few months ago, we wanted to load it with as much helpful and practical information as possible. So it has a very nicely formatted booklet edition of the three key documents, namely Summorum Pontificum, the letter to the bishops that went along with it, and Universe Ecclesiae in a better translation than you can get on the Vatican website.
Yeah, see, these resources, it's unfortunate that these resources don't exist in a centralized location. I mean, I know that the Latin Mass Society of England and Wales has some fantastic resources on their website. I mean, different places, you have to kind of go on a scavenger hunt to find these pieces. Exactly.
Yeah, no, you just have to kind of explore. It's like the big rambling old mansion of the church, and you have to open up some of the doors.
All the rooms.
Exactly, and see what's there.
So let me ask you this. This is something that came up recently because I have some friends who are now attending the Latin Mass who are converts. And, they're new friends. I've met them recently. And I saw the husband at Mass a few weeks ago. And I just said to him, hey, how's it going, with the Latin Mass? I mean, it's a big jump. I think they were Southern Baptists before. I'm not 100% sure, but kind of a big jump, and I see him there and they got all these kids. And he said, I trust that it's good. And I trust God, that he's given this to us, but I'm having a really hard time figuring out what's going on. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't help because they have a young family. So somebody's always having to walk the kid who starts screaming and, that kind of stuff. Are there good resources? I mean, if you were going to pull stuff that's not, too academic, too deep dive, if you could name 2 or 3 books, good resources that we could give to people who are trying to learn this, because I worry so much that them not being given a means of understanding means that they're just going to run. They're going to run away.
You're right. Well, okay, fortunately, there is one book that I would just recommend hands down, first thing everybody should read if they want to learn about the Old Mass, and that's this book by Father James Jackson. It's called Nothing Superfluous. And it's
I think you mentioned this to me.
It's published by Fraternity Publications. Father Jackson is a priest of the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter. He's stationed in Littleton, Denver at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which is one of the most flourishing apostolates I've ever been to. It's an incredible place, and just absolutely packed with families for all their masses. But anyway, he wrote this book over several years precisely with people like that in mind. It goes step by step through every part of the Mass. He talks about, at the beginning, he talks about vestments, and then he talks about the symbolism of them all. And then he goes into the Mass and why does the priest do this and do that, and what's the story behind this? But it's told in such a sort of a charming and humble manner. It's not a scholarly work, but it's obvious that he's read all the scholarship, so he knows what he's talking about. But I
think that people need non-scholarly works.
Oh yeah, no,
they
absolutely.
Need to be able to sit down at night and read something that doesn't put them to sleep.
Yeah, no, this book has no footnotes in it. But it reads very smoothly, and it's just the thing that I love about it is every page has an observation on it or a connection that just makes you open your mouth and say, "Oh my goodness, that is so beautiful. That is so wonderful. That's so amazing. I had no idea." And I mean, this is the key, right? If your friend, the friends you're talking about, if they could just read a few pages of this at a time, they would just fall in love. They would fall in love with the Old Mass, and it would become like, it becomes in a way. You talked about a scavenger hunt. It's kind of like an Easter egg hunt. The Old Mass is just packed full of symbolism at every level, and it opens itself to you slowly over time. I mean, I've been into this for decades now. I've been going to Mass as often as I can and reading about it, and I'm still learning new things all the time. That it's so ancient and so great that it just has this sort of endless explorability to it, and so I would definitely recommend Father Jackson's book, Nothing Superfluous.
I'm sort of surreptitiously putting it in my cart right now. As you're talking.
And then, I mean, again, a little bit of shameless self-promotion here, but I think my book is helpful. People have told me that Resurgent in the Midst of Crisis has been helpful to them in understanding a lot of aspects of the liturgy.
Okay. Yeah. And so I can link to both of those. I think they're good resources. There's that the St. Augustine Academy Press has that Treasure and Tradition book that's thanks for bringing a visual riot of all the things, the symbols, the vestments.
Yes, that's also a very fine resource, and I would especially recommend that as a catechetical tool. Let's say for homeschooled students in upper grades, I think that could be a marvelous unit just to read that carefully and talk about it.
Cool. All right. So let me ask you this last question. What do you think the future holds now for the traditional movement? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? I think that we've grown since 2007, but there also seems to, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we seem to have kind of hit a plateau. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really hard slog. That is to say, I think the traditional movement is strong and healthy, but it's small. It's a tough, wiry minority that knows what it stands for, knows what's important. I mean, I'm speaking generally here. Obviously, there's a lot of variety in terms of knowledge and motivation and so on. But I think in general, as a cross-section of the church, the traditional Catholics are the ones who are much better catechized. They love the liturgy. They want to live according to the calendar of the church. They want to tap into the spiritual resources, the fathers of the church or the mystics, or whatever. So I think the traditional movement is disproportionately influential and powerful to its numbers. And I think that's something we see in salvation history. I always want to be a bit careful about using language of like the remnant or something like that. But it is true that throughout church history, reform movements start with individuals or with small groups. They don't start with just a huge mob of people deciding one day that they're going to reform themselves, right? That never happens. This is part of the problem with democracy. It's a kind of lowest common denominator system, right? So, I mean, really what history shows is great things happen when monarchs or aristocrats, either literally or spiritually, figuratively, when they take action and when they mobilize, that's when important things start to happen. So I'm optimistic in the sense that, the Lord has given us so much, so many great gifts, so many blessings, so many graces that we don't deserve, and that people thought 20 years ago were just extinct forever, right? They thought this is never coming back. We've killed this, and it's not.
Well, and
dead.
it's providential, I think, that the traditionalist movement has sort of come of age at the time where the internet did as well. I mean, we have a way of getting the message out there that just didn't exist.
Sure. Well, I mean, somebody said, I forget who said this, but somebody said that, I think it was Matt Menendez, said that the traditional movement has succeeded because of two things, the Holy Spirit and the internet. And I think that's completely true.
I think that's legitimate.
But the other thing too that is, I mean, I thought this is what you meant initially, is that the traditionalist movement really only gained its maximum. It gained strength in numbers long after the old Mass, as it had been in the 1950s, had died. I mean, that is to say, there was a certain kind of culture that sometimes surrounded the old Mass before the council that was part of the reason why the council happened and part of the reason why the reforms happened, or at least why they seemed plausible and necessary. Mm-hmm. And so now when you see a lot of young priests and young musicians, young families going to Mass, and often they are singing the chants or the responses in a way that people often didn't do in the old days, or they're more eager about it. It's something fresh. It's something beautifully. It's like stumbling into into the Garden of Eden through the back door, and you didn't know it was there, or like going through the enchanted. What was that? In the Chronicles of Narnia,
through the wardrobe.
Right, through the wardrobe, So there's a sense in which there's a kind of freshness and a new perspective on traditional things. They're choosing it,
and they're making sacrifices to have it. It means something to them.
Exactly, and that's all to the good, because I do think, somebody said this too, that maybe the reason why the Mass had to go away is because finally everybody was taking it for granted. And I mean, that would be a really, really severe mercy, a really harsh disciplinary move on God's part. But
don't you think that that's the theme of everything we're seeing in the church right now? Is that we had taken for granted these things that we had, and we've come so far now that this crisis that we're faced with, not just in the liturgy, but in theology and in the approach to marriage and the family and sacramental discipline and all this stuff, it's waking people up. It's shaking the people who love God and care, but had become sort of complacent and comfortable with the status quo. Everybody's being forced to reevaluate all of this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why, I mean, as much of a mess as things are right now, I mean, the old adage about things have to get worse before they get better certainly seems to me to be true right now. I mean, I think when the dust settles on the pontificate of Pope Francis, I think the traditional movement will be much stronger, much more well-defined, much more organized. I mean, it's almost now as if you feel bound to a whole international community of Catholics who are all equally incensed about the insanities, and who are all equally wanting to recommit themselves to the fullness of the faith. I think that this is not the kind of thing, well, what Hilary White says, that the church couldn't have survived another conservative papacy.
I think it's true.
And that, there's a way in which conservatism lulls people to sleep, right? Oh, things are basically fine. They're a little rough around the edges, but everything's going to be fine.
It's because the goalposts keep moving on what you're willing to conserve.
Exactly. And so when you see, wait a minute, you wake up one day and you see things aren't going to be fine. Things are horrible, right? Then it really, it's like that statement attributed to Samuel Johnson, execution. A man's execution has a wonderful way of waking him up, or something like that. I forget exactly how it goes, but the idea is when you're face to face with catastrophe, then you actually take life very seriously, and your priorities become realigned, and all sorts of things happen.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is
grants clarity. Disaster grants clarity.
Yes,
for sure.
Exactly.
So there are questions that I think that in a future podcast that we could talk about, because as much as there's a significant portion of our audience that is already dedicated to the traditional Latin Mass. We've put up a couple of pieces in the last week. I dug Bishop Schneider's piece on liturgical reform, 10 things to do to reform the liturgy, out of the archives, because for the vast majority of Catholics, they are still sort of stuck in Novus Ordo land. And there are things that can be done, that need to be done, to move them in the direction of sacred liturgy. And I think that can be a podcast in itself. So if you're willing to come back, I'd like to break off those questions I was going to ask you and do a separate
Sure,
episode.
something, a more reform of the reform conversation. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes. As long as we can agree on the premise that the reform of the reform is not an end in itself. It has to move us toward...
No, it's a temporary stage just to rebuild the bridge back to the liturgical tradition.
Then I think we can be friends.
Good. I always want to be friends.
All right, good. Well, thank you so much for taking so much time to be on, and it was good to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, Steve.
All right, take care.
God bless.
You've been listening to the OnePeterFive podcast. This has been a production of OnePeterFive Incorporated. Copyright 2017, all rights reserved. Please remember to visit us online at OnePeterFive.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to support our work at OnePeterFive.com/donate. Thank you for listening.